Hi, I'm Kevin Millett, and today we're going to talk about the transformation of an application team at Bank of America. My last work assignment was to deal with an application that was experiencing 2 to 3 critical outages a week. The state of things were poor. The stakeholders were constantly escalating to executive management, rightfully so. The impacts here were affecting their production line. The next area that I wanted to address was the team's change management. At that point, they were a waterfall team, and I knew there was areas that we could improve. And the third area for opportunity was just an overall improvement to monitoring. The team itself was a monitoring team, and there was always a decree to improve monitoring and then try to use that and scale it across the enterprise. When we take a look at the division of process, people, and technology, this was all three: technology, people, and processes. It took a lot of work to rein in these issues here. The change management and the improvements here, you'd think that this would be a technology on the monitoring improvement, but actually turned out to be just more process. And the change management was a combination of both process and people, because you have to convince people to adopt a new strategy. Now, when we got to the 2 to 3 outages a week, the very first thing that we did was analyze the postmortems and then improved that postmortem cycle to pull in more data so that we had more to analyze and identify root cause. And what we had found is, once we bucketed these issues, the majority of them sat in one area, and that was our virtualization stack. This portion of the outages was responsible for 70% of our outages and needed to be addressed first. It was our big rock that we needed to tackle. This caused us to have a very strong relationship with this team. And in corporate culture, especially when you're trying to get to root cause, there's a tendency to blame storm, point fingers. And as a leader, it's your responsibility to help address that and make it a collaborative environment versus fostering one of pushing the responsibility of the blame onto another group. We'd come down to 4 or 5 major items that were part of this group. Some of them were technology-based, some of them were process-based, but we worked together to help remove those issues. And I was happy to report, after a few months of integrating with them, we were able to remove all those issues and reduce the issues to more of a gentle roar versus a tidal wave. When we looked at the next set, the next 25% were self-implemented, and that speaks to our change management process. Now, what's interesting with change management is this, I think I mentioned, was a waterfall deployment. And I really am a fan of Agile. And I like the Agile process. I like DevOps. And for those that are familiar, we have our infinity symbol here, and then we have our CI/CD. So we're constantly improving here. And then we follow a model of plan, build, test, deploy, operate, monitor. So where before we were waterfall, I now wanted to move into this DevOps fashion. And I wanted to cut the responsibility of our deployment from the development team itself into our operational teams, which means that at the point between test and deploy, when we're actually handling that nuclear football of code off to our operation teams, this area here had to be perfect. What we needed to do was build a process that would allow us to take extremely complicated code and installation procedures and give that to a team who's not that core responsibility, so there's no familiarity there, and have them be able to do the same installations error-free. There were a lot of things in that process that we had to update. Code reviews, testing policies. It was a fairly comprehensive overhaul. Overall, this process to get to this was about 14 months between addressing the critical outages and getting the change management to a point where the last quarter of my assignment, we were error-free. The last portion here was the improvement in monitoring. And we're going to talk about, once we have stability, what we can do with data that puts us a level above everybody else. As far as the improvements with the outages and the change management, immediately the stability improved considerably. We went from 2 to 3 critical outages a week, and as previously mentioned, the last quarter, 0 issues. We did get the occasional net new error, but overall, we weren't getting the complaints from the stakeholders like we were originally at the onset of the assignment. Once we were able to change the development method from waterfall to agile, what we noticed was an uptick in the productivity of our engineers. Because our engineers were no longer inundated with the responsibility of creating change requests, implementing the change, testing the change, their only core responsibility was to develop, plan, build, and test those changes, and then hand over that package to the operations team. It freed them up about 25 to 30% of their overall daily schedule. And because our changes were primarily moved to the nighttime, it also helped stabilize their schedules so they weren't doing these late nights every month doing production deployments. The other thing too is a more organized cadence to our team and how we met and how we discussed things and made decisions. When you talk about managing a team or leading a team, there's a lot of questions about how that team is structured, how decisions are come to. And what I really like about Agile is I prescribe to servant leadership, and we use the retrospectives as an opportunity to get the feedback from the engineers and then help make and mold that process. When I get buy-in from the engineers, the adoption rate increases dramatically. And the last thing was, as we were closing this up, we were near our CI/CD, continuous improvement, continuous development. Although this wasn't finalized at my exodus, they did eventually finish this portion, which was the wrap-up of all of this change management process. This was a crowning achievement because in September of the year I left. September is always a very difficult month, mostly because although your performance pay is based on what they consider a full year's work, those conversations technically begin in September, October, which means there's a ton of pressure to get all of the work that you want to be considered as part of your performance bonus in before that time frame. So September is usually big crunch time for us. We were able to scale our deployments 300% without a single interruption. It was beautiful and measurable and repeatable. Great job with this team, by the way. Now let's talk about this improvement monitoring. So now once we've created peak stability, the next step is how do we go from 95% of the errors being caught and dealt with to 100? And what I found is that there is a process by which we would do our incident management. And it would start off like this. The very first thing is you experience the outage. And not only is it an outage, it's a net new outage. The second thing that we're going to take a look at and try to do is do our restoral. So we're going to do our service restoral here. So we're going to experience it. Mostly what this means is we're going to either fail over to a different environment, we're going to roll back some changes, we're going to restart services to see if that corrects the issue. The next thing we do is a post-mortem. And this is where we identify what root cause was. And then the last thing is to create monitoring around that condition so that in subsequent periods, we catch it before it becomes a problem. And this works very well. So over time, what you're doing is you're taking the main issues that are coming in, the ones that you're going to experience, and you put a process around it that helps you monitor for them and then prevent them from becoming an impacting event. You don't want to impact clients. The problem is this cycle is that for every net new issue, you have to feel the pain just once, or at least once. It's kind of like your inoculation, like your immune system is not ready to deal with this. You have to experience the issue, then you have to identify the pain points and get in there and fix whatever the attack is. And then you learn from that and you build antibodies for it. Very similar. The analogies are pretty keen. How do we get past having to experience net new outages every single time? During the postmortems, the surprising fact is that there were always breadcrumbs to be found. It wasn't as if an issue came up completely unannounced. If you were smart and you were looking at the right things, technically you would be able to find breadcrumbs that were indicative of a problem. The issue is that the data is so voluminous that for an analyst to be able to identify that needle in a haystack is impossible or close to it. Seeing this, I decided that let's use machine learning. So we would take a portion of the log and using a statistical algorithm, we would train this to identify what we considered okay messaging. And then there were two different variants that would allow me to trigger an alert. And one of those being a brand new error message or type that came across the board that we hadn't seen before. The other one is an escalation of already existing errors outside of what we consider normal variance. And so if we see 30 errors of this in an hour, and then the next hour we see 500 of them, although we know that that error is normally not indicative of a problem, it's the volume of said messaging that really does create a problem. We created a program to monitor these logs, and every quarter we would update them because the issue is that it's not that creating the algorithm is difficult, it's testing it. And we only had maybe one of these incidents that were net new a quarter at best. And so you really had to have everything set up properly in order to be able to catch that one incident. The last version of this was very quiet for a few months. And then I came in one day and it was lit up like a Christmas tree. We took the error message, I popped that over to the operations side. I said, I need to know what this message means yesterday. I was able to get the response back quickly. This was impacting a security feature as part of the application. Could have possibly been a pink slip event, but the fact that we had caught it well before it actually had impacted the production environment meant that we were able to put in an emergency change that evening to correct the issue. It was my first time in the 11 or so years as a monitoring expert that we were able to get in front of a net new issue without having to experience the inoculation or the actual pain from it. Now, will this fix everything? No. By proxy of this process, what we've done is we've already cleared out 95 to 97% of the major events that are going to impact your application that are common. Network-related issues, storage-related issues, you name it. We've already had monitoring built around it. So this isn't a catch-all for every single thing. But once you have an environment that is running smoothly, now you're able to put into effect a program to check for those variants. I will say that this was most likely the most crowning achievement in my career, and I'll tell you why. I gave a 500-person speech lecture to Bank of America based on our findings from this and how we were using artificial intelligent operations to help scale our analysts to be able to prevent the outages of the future. In my career, I had spent a lot of time at the table talking about innovation. And typically an innovation meeting goes like this. What are we doing? Who is the main guy in our vertical? What is he doing? How did we get there? And so many a time I'd spent being a small fish at a small table discussing how we could catch up to guys like Bank of America. And at the end of my being employed by other people, I had come full circle and I was out with the big guy telling them how to stay ahead of everybody else. My name is Kevin Millett. Thank you for listening.